Well, welcome to another special episode of 10-Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about 12 different things that I have learned in my journey collecting vintage jazz on vinyl. Now, none of what I'm presenting here is the gospel truth. These are things which I've learned. My insights are my own. They're helpful to me. You may disagree. And in fact, I'm sure most people will disagree with at least one thing I say here. So please do add your thoughts in the comments below. I've been collecting jazz actively for a little less than a decade, but my love for jazz goes back many, many years before. And I've tried to divide these 12 points into three broad areas. One is knowing your taste and identity as a record buyer and as a collector. Secondly, the record market, how to understand it, what strategies to use. And third, curating your own collection. The first and probably the biggest single thing that I've learned in collecting jazz is the necessity of opening your mind to other genres, letting your experience take you to different places that you never thought you'd be particularly interested in, because of course jazz is an enormously varied and broad universe. There are lots of different ways to do this. You can join different communities. You'd be amazed at what you can learn about kinds of jazz that you never knew existed. It's important to trust your taste, but it's also important to understand that your taste is going to change as time goes by. So my prejudices, for instance, were formed by the very first records that I ever heard when I was basically knee-high to a duck, 4, 5, 6 years old. And in fact, I recognize now, most of my early beliefs and prejudices, and when I say early, up until like when I was 45 or 50, my early beliefs and prejudices about jazz were formed on the basis of listening to two records, both of which my father had. This is not his copy, nor is the next one for that matter. Dave Brubeck's Time Out and Stan Getz and Joao Gilberto's seminal bossa nova record, Getz Gilberto. From these records, the two records upon which I formed almost all my jazz beliefs, I understood that the saxophone was the most important instrument in jazz. I wasn't that interested in the piano or the trumpet. I came to understand that bossa nova was a far more essential thing to jazz and was actually the case. Anyway, lots of other kinds of sort of ill-formed ideas, which I never really pursued. I just kind of thought these things, and I was really into rock and other music when I was younger, and these were just things that I knew. I didn't know anything about Miles Davis. I didn't know anything about John Coltrane. These were just names, but I didn't need to know them because everything I needed to know about jazz was contained in these two records. So just being open to experience. The second part of this, of your taste and identity, is knowing your own identity as a record buyer. And this is also really important because it's distinct from the kinds of music you like. And there are a number of different ways people approach buying records and collecting records. And of course, these can change over time. You don't have to be one or the other of these. You can be all of these at the same time, or you might be one, then you move to the other. First of all, are you essentially buying to listen to the music, absent any other consideration? This is basically who I am with some modification. And if you are buying to listen to the music, is it the actual music and the notes which matters, or is it the sound of the music? Are you in fact an audiophile? Can you live with the crackle of a vintage record, or does everything have to be pristine? This is kind of what I struggle with sometimes. Here's a good example. This is a record by Gabor Szabo on his own label, Sky Records. It's a little bit cheesy, but it's got some really great tracks on it. It's kind of the pop jazz he was playing towards the end of the 1960s. Very, very difficult to find this in pristine condition. And this has got some pops and crackles on it. And I had traded up from a previous copy that had slightly more pops and crackles on it. I'm still not 100% certain that I'm happy with this particular version, but I'm going to stick with it for a while. But again, you just often find yourself at that inflection point. Is this listenable? Is it not? And it's kind of good to know when you're buying records whether you're a near mint kind of person, or you're a very good kind of person, or I am basically a very good plus kind of person. Conversely, are you buying scarce records for their very scarcity because you like to collect rare and interesting things? Another variation is, of course, buying as an investment. I'll have more to say about that later. Are you buying these records not so much to listen to them, or maybe to listen to them, but mainly to store them carefully so that they can increase in value and you can sell them for a profit? Finally, are you buying records because records somehow conjure up mid-20th century old school cool, and is the act of getting a record out of the sleeve and putting it on and having your turntable prominently displayed in your very hip dwelling, is that what turns your crank. I will own up to almost all of these being a part of who I am, although fundamentally I'm about the music. There's nothing wrong with being any of these, but depending on which one you are, that will really affect what is important to you about the record market and how you enter it and what's going to be acceptable and the kinds of strategies you employ. And talking about the record market, the first thing I've taken on board is it's important to learn what prices mean. So, first of all, let's just start with the obvious that prices, particularly of vintage jazz records, are not going down. I track the 20 most expensive records that I had starting in 2019. I've been doing that every month or two for 4 years, and they're now worth 39% more than they were then. And that's not unusual. In fact, I think in some respects, I'm kind of unlucky. I think some other records have been going up even more in price. But in any event, the days of scoring fantastic buys just by flipping through the bins and going to thrift stores and so on and getting the basis of a great collection that way are pretty much gone. You can still luck out here and there, but for the most part, you have to be a little bit more strategic. There are exceptions. Sometimes people selling records don't know what they have. This is particularly true of people handling estate sales, for instance, where they lack the motivation to figure it out. But when I say that you have to learn what prices mean and don't mean, what I mean by that is that quality, quantity, and vintage alone don't determine the price. Price is sometimes driven by other things, like how fashionable certain records are. And I think the best example of this is Blue Note. Now, don't get me wrong, Blue Note has a fantastic catalog of great records. But if you want to buy an original pressing of a Blue Note, setting aside Jimmy Smith, who's cheaper because he put out a million organ records, and frankly, those are variable quality. But setting aside Jimmy Smith, you want to buy an original Blue Note pressing from the 1950s, you're going to be paying many hundreds of dollars, sometimes into the thousands of dollars for something in playable condition. If you got into that market earlier on, or if you have the resources to buy those original pressings of the Blue Notes, good on you, and I'm happy for you, and frankly, I'm jealous. I personally own, well, I own a couple of early 60s and one late 50s Blue Note, and that is basically it. Why? Not because I don't like the music, but because I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. Why would I spend $500 on an original pressing of a Blue Note record when I could buy five, six, seven original pressings of Impulse records or contemporary records from around the same era, equivalent musical quality, and sometimes recorded to a higher standard? In short, I guess I'm making the case that collecting original Blue Notes is cool because they're original Blue Notes, but also because collecting original Blue Notes is what serious jazz collectors with deep pockets do. And that is not necessarily always directly correlated to the quality of the music on the record. I've said before, I find a lot of the hard bop stuff that Blue Note was putting out to be a little bit samey. Maybe it's because I haven't had the virtue of listening to the original pressings, but I do think that value for money can be applied better elsewhere. The next lesson for the beginning collector is to consider bulk buys. Now, I've just said that the age of classic sort of cheapo deals is over, but when you only have a few records, there's a real upside to buying a big box of 100 or 200 LPs just on spec. You can hit thrift shops, you can hit garage sales, you can go to estate sales, as I mentioned. I personally have had a lot of joy at auctions. And in fact, my re entry into the world of vinyl collecting actually happened at an auction because years ago I had given away a lot of my vinyl collection. And then we were at an auction and a lot of records came up, a box of records, about 100 of them. I hadn't even checked out the records that were in there, but they showed a picture of the box and they had pulled three records out. And I said to myself, well, to the extent that I know anything about the vinyl market, I know those three records are worth probably $70 in total. So anyway, the bidding starts at 50, goes down to 10, goes down to 2, and my hand just goes up. And long story short, I left the auction house that night with 350 records for which I'd spent a total of $60. Now, did I keep most of those records? No, but I probably have 60 or 70 of those records, which actually is a pretty good hit rate. Even if I'd only gotten 30 or 40, it would have been a hell of a deal. Provided that you're in a relatively target rich environment, you buy a box of 100 records, you're going to find 5 or 10 keepers in there. The rest can go to the Salvation Army store. And the other great thing about this is that buying random stuff exposes you to music you'd never encounter otherwise. No matter how much you think you know about the world of jazz, you're going to be blown away by certain records that just show up when you buy a random bunch of records. The next lesson when you're dipping your toe into the record market is to cut through the BS, of which there's a lot. And there is no bigger single piece of BS than all the marketing around 180-gram heavy vinyl records. Is the weight of your vinyl relevant to sound quality? Well, yeah, I guess so. But frankly, it is the least of your concerns because making a record is a physical process from the recording of the music, putting it onto tape, good mastering, good quality lacquer cutting, lots of other kind of quality assurance pieces all the way through. And of all the things you should be worried about, I would say vinyl weight should be the very last on your list. Other than those nasty Dynaflex records, which appeared in the mid 1970s, which warped pretty easily, there's lots of other things that you should prioritize worrying about. And in fact, there are 180-gram records which sound terrible. If sound quality matters to you, then don't worry about the weight of the record. Worry about whether it's an all analog process, that is to say, whether there's any digital steps in the process, and or how early the pressing was. And just because something's got a fancy sticker on it that says remastering, don't get suckered by this. Do the research. Yes, it's a rabbit hole, and at a certain point there are diminishing returns to all this stuff. See also the Steve Hoppin forums for those diminishing returns. It's a rabbit hole, but there is a lot of stuff being cut these days directly from CD or with other slightly less heinous digital sins in the process. And if that sort of stuff matters to you, pay attention. And just on the BS part, although this is really more of a clarification than it is about BS, just a word about the phrase deep groove. Deep groove is not anything innate to the actual grooves of the record. It's actually an indentation in the center part of the label, which indicates usually that the record was made before 1963. But all that means is it's old. Just because something is a deep groove record doesn't mean it actually sounds good. That depends on the label and on the technology used and the standards applied and so on. Some labels are reliable and others absolutely aren't. Give an example of this. This is a record on, what is it, Crown Records, which, sometimes they're okay, sometimes they're not, but it's, hopefully you can see the indentation just there. And you can probably also see that the record itself is, it's got that weird kind of shimmery pattern, which I don't really understand. And maybe that's related to the problems I'm going to say, but in general, it's extremely clean, has barely been played. Why is it barely been played? Because when you play this record, it sounds like there's a sort of power sander convention happening. There's so much surface noise on the record that it's actually in my giveaway box. So just because it's deep groove doesn't mean it sounds good. The next lesson I've learned is it's important to develop a strategy. What record specifically do you want? And if you don't know, how would you go about determining that? Who's got those records? How are you going to find those records? What labels and what era have the greatest concentration of the records you're interested in? For me, at the moment, the answer is that I'm really interested in jazz released between 1950 and 1963. And so here's an example. This is a first pressing of the Shelley Mann record, My Fair Lady, which was one of contemporary's big sellers. But normally speaking, when I'm searching for records, or if I'm on DISCOGS, or if I'm just going through the bins in my local record store, I'm specifically asking for records on particular labels from a particular era, because I know, having done the research and spent some time reading about this and listening to what I like, that is where my interests are concentrated currently. Not 3 years ago, and probably not 3 years from now, but currently they are. It also may be that there's a particular area of the world where there is a heavy concentration of the music that you're interested in. So I went through phases a couple of years ago where I was buying a ton of bossa nova, and also later on a ton of Latin music. And the bossa nova, obviously heavily concentrated in Brazil. And one of the things that happened there was I ended up corresponding with a guy who ended up being a bit of a contact for me, would actually go and search out stuff in local record shops, which was awesome. Sometimes you're actually able to go to that area. So for instance, it shouldn't be too surprising that you're going to score more classic hard bop records in New York than you are any other part of the United States. You're going to be able to find great West Coast jazz records in LA and San Francisco, simply because that's where these bands were known. They were popular, they sold more records there, and those records have found their way into the used bins. And out of all this, when you've thought about the label and the era and the kinds of music and the particular locations, maybe the individual sellers you're interested in, and so on, it helps to have a list. Because the more you get into buying jazz and exploring jazz, the more you realize how little you know. I mean, as I said earlier, I knew nothing really until my middle 40s anyway, really, about the jazz world. But it's true for anybody. So start a list. I talked to friends of mine who were collectors. That was fantastic. Often they told me about things which I bought and loved and continue to collect. Sometimes they told me about things which were absolutely terrible, but more power to them. I also did, because I'm kind of a research nerd, a sort of a meta analysis. So if you go onto the internet and you type in top 10 or top 50 or top 100 jazz records, you can find a whole bunch of different lists. I just took all these lists, dumped them all into an Excel sheet, figured out which ones were getting mentioned most frequently, and kind of created a master list for myself of not necessarily records that I wanted, but records that everybody else seemed to think were the best records to collect. Then I just started listening on, streaming them and experimenting if I found them cheaply, or seeking them out if I knew I wanted them, and so on. And certainly to build up a collection, that was an effective strategy, because I had a list of about 500 records where if I saw the record, I was going to grab it if I could find it for a decent price. But the trouble with any best of list, as you'll know if you've ever read a best of list, is that they're basically there partly to inform and partly as clickbait, because there are almost always egregious errors on these lists, at least from your own perspective. Your own taste will rapidly bump up against some of the records on these lists. And that's okay. And I'll have more to say about that in a little bit. Finally, in terms of a strategy, I think getting to know record store owners is a highly underrated technique, because not only do these folks have a vested interest in knowing the market extremely well, they also will often have a separate stash of records which they don't put out because they are valuable, but they have a real sort of niche appeal. But if you get to know them and you start talking about your tastes and so on, it's surprising how many times people will say, well, actually, I have whatever it is, this collection of things. So, for instance, there's a record store guy that I was just talking to the other day in Vancouver who has a large selection of 10-inch jazz records from 1952 to 1955, which I've been collecting a lot of. And he says, oh, I've got a whole bunch of those. Just let me know the next time you're coming in. I'll bring them in, right? So, too bad bank balance. The next lesson is, I think, a necessary evil, and that is learning to use DISCOGS. Learn to use the features of DISCOGS to narrow your search, because there are, as we know, tens of millions of records in there, and it's very overwhelming. And the search functions aren't necessarily state-of-the-art search functions, but still there's a lot of useful tools there. I found that it's very useful to use the want list function in a very focused and narrow way. I don't just keep throwing records onto my want list until it's like 2 or 3,000 records long and the wrong pressings and so on. I'm now very, very selective, and I'll use it very specifically when I'm looking for, say, 4 or 5 records from a particular label, but only certain pressings. I'll just use a want list specifically for those, maybe 15 or 16. I'll then search and I'll see what sellers have got multiple copies of that. And then maybe there's some economies of scale in buying some of those records. If you take the opposite approach and you just simply keep throwing records into your want list ad nauseum, eventually, not only is it overwhelming, it kind of becomes noise, because you're searching for a record and you see that, this person has 75 records that you want, but some of them were from like 3 years ago when you were really into, 1970s Beatles alumni records and so on, and you're not that interested today. So it's important, I think, to have a little bit of hygiene in your want list. Another part of this, as I implied just now, is that shipping is getting much more expensive, has done since COVID. And so it's even more important than it used to be to find sellers who have multiple copies of different things that you're interested in. It's also really important to understand and read the negative comments on sellers. If somebody's below 99%, that's a problem. Well, you might say, well, geez, 99% is pretty good if you're writing a math test. Sure. But if 1 out of every 100 planes that took off crashed, well, then maybe you can see that number a little differently. And often when you buy a record and you spend whatever, 30, 40 bucks, maybe more, maybe $100 on a record and the shipping, and it shows up and it's in terrible condition, or it's the wrong pressing. It's not quite a plane crash, but it feels a little bit not great. Personally, I found the sweet spot to be about 99.5%. I wouldn't typically buy from a seller who had a rating below that, unless I determined that they used to have an issue and they don't anymore. And it's also important that if you get a record which shows up which is not the right record, the wrong pressing, or bad condition, that you are assertive with them. Polite, yes, but also assertive, because you are entitled in most cases to a complete refund of that. And most sellers will acknowledge that. And this happens. So here's an example. This is kind of a rare record, or at least the original pressing of this record is quite rare. This is the second of the 4 volumes on original vinyl of Shelly Mann's live set at the Black Hawk in 1960 or 61. Anyway, this was advertised, I won't mention the seller, but it was advertised as an original pressing, which is frankly just sloppy as hell, because it actually has on here a sticker which very clearly marks it out as not an original pressing, in fact as a 70s reissue. So anyway, that's been resolved, but again, just sloppy, right? And you should not be shy about calling out that sloppy stuff. Now, this next lesson may just be me, but I think it's really important to value doing research on labels and pressings, particularly if you care about sound quality or your investment. As a general rule, if you consider yourself an audiophile, I don't, although I kind of, I'm audiophile adjacent. I flirt with audiophilia, I guess. Unless you're purchasing records you know are all analog with lots of care taken, I would just tend to avoid all digitally sourced vinyl of older records. In my experience, if you can't afford the originals, it's often better to get a bargain pressing, sometimes from the early 1970s. The Japanese in particular, around 1972 or 1973, repressed all kinds of classic jazz records, and many of those pressings are actually excellent. There are some labels like Kraft and people like Kevin Gray who are taking some real care over more recent reissues of classic jazz records. Now, those aren't cheap to buy, but they're cheaper than the original pressings. But in general, and I used to poo-poo this sort of statement, but I've come around to it, and yes, there are some exceptions, but in general, the earlier the pressing, the better. And this is for the simple fact that record making is a physical process, and whether it's the equipment or the lacquers or the tapes or second or third generation copies or what have you, these things decay over time. In some cases, and this is again things you can find out by researching, the tapes have actually been destroyed. This is very sadly the case with a whole bunch of classic impulse releases from the late 60s and early 1970s, which is why some of those are very expensive, because collectors know that you're never really ever going to get an all analog version of those records again unless you buy the original pressings. But all is not lost. I mentioned those Japanese pressings from 1973, particularly from King Records. There are also other reissue periods that offer real value for money, and in particular, you'll sometimes hear some chat, I think justified, about original jazz classics pressings, not later on, but from 1984 and 1985, original jazz classics in particular without the barcodes on, which offer, to my ears, great value for money. And that's also true for some Blue Note reissues from that period as well. It's sometimes tricky to find out the book on a particular pressing, but if it's a very commonly owned and widespread and often pressed record like Miles Davis's Kind of Blue or Coltrane's Love Supreme or what have you, look at the comments on the individual pressings on DISCOGS. Not if it's just one or two, but if it's a whole bunch of comments, then sometimes the wisdom of the crowd is something that's worth paying attention to. Figure out those nasty labels which are just cutting records from CD. A lot of these are based in Eastern Europe. They're taking advantage of records copyright lapsing, or maybe they're just frankly just pressing them illegally. They often have nice glossy packages and gatefolds and so on, and funky cover art. I'm talking about Wax Time, talking about Doxy, DOL. Avoid. Here's my copy of Monin, which falls into this category. Does not sound particularly good. It's put out by DOL. It's 180 gram though, but it doesn't sound great. Why? It's just cut from a CD, and the keener-eyed viewers will notice the lack of any kind of Blue Note identification here. It does, however, have a fancy gatefold cover and so on. Anyway, when I get motivated, I'm not the biggest Art Blakey fan in the world, which is why I still have this, but when I get motivated, I'm going to replace this. Learn about matrix numbers. This is also really important. Now, matrix numbers seem kind of overwhelming. These are these long strings of numerals and letters and digits and so on in the dead wax, but they contain some key information. Sometimes when you learn it, it's pretty simple. And one of the great places to learn about this is actually a wonderful site on the net called London Jazz Collector, which is run by a guy in the UK who meets that description, but he's got some great information on some particular labels, particularly Blue Note, Contemporary, and a few others. So for instance, on Contemporary, when you look at the matrix numbers in the runout, the D number tells you how early the pressing was. So if it's D1, you know this is the first pressing, D2, D3, D4, and so on, going up to like D9, and getting back to that whole issue of things decaying over time. That's really meaningful information. I can tell you, testing with my own ears, that D1s sound great. And as I said, with the example of that Shelly Manne record, when your record arrives, verify that the pressing that was advertised is the pressing that you bought, because that will matter in terms of sound quality, it'll matter in terms of value, and it's always a good idea to hold people to account if they're being sloppy. With respect to all of this audiophilia, the end of the day, it's important to trust your own ears. You're the one that has to listen to these records. A lot of the stuff I've been saying right now will matter to audiophiles, may not matter to somebody who just likes the whole idea of having 30, 40 jazz records to spin and isn't going to be sitting there listening for sibilants or the highest of highs or the lowest of lows. The final lesson I've taken on board with respect to the record market is the value of the various parts of the crate when you're in the record store. So you're in a record store, you're flipping through the crates, here's the Cannonball Adderleys, here are the John Coltrane's, here's the Miles Davises, flip, 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 flip. And you look through there, what do you find? You find either really sort of crappy sort of B-list reissues, or very highly priced brand new all analog repressings of those particular artists, usually well picked over. In between all these, for every letter of the alphabet, you've got all the artists whose name starts with A or B or C, who somehow or other didn't merit their own little divider. And this, to my experience, particularly as my own collecting has narrowed in focus, is where the real gold is, because a lot of people don't even look at these particular sections. They're not as well picked over, and often they contain, as your knowledge grows, really interesting and rare and excellent records that maybe the staff in the record store don't really appreciate or haven't decided to pull out and put on the wall and charge $50 for, and so on. Anyway, don't ignore those various crates. Dig into them. In fact, I go to them first. This final section of this video is about curating your collection. And the first thing I would say, first lesson, is be realistic about the extent to which this is an investment. Now, I mentioned that some people get into this, and I hear about this now and then through the channel about people, I bought this record as an investment. I'm, keeping it safely. I'm waiting for its value to increase, and so on. DISCOGS tells you that your record collection has value, and it has value to you, but it also has a significant cost to actually realize that value by liquidating the collection because of the hours required. How many hours did it take you to amass your collection? To realize its value, you'd have to spend the same amount of time basically selling, marketing, doing all the rest of it. And that's if you're doing it. Now, if it's part of your estate and you've gone to the great disco in the sky and your family and friends or your executor are dealing with your record collection, they are not going to have the patience even you would. Again, DISCOGS values are basically your replacement cost. They're not the value that you should expect at sale. They might be for an individual record, but not as a group. You're not going to be able to put all 100 of your Beach Boys records up and get that exact value. You're going to get something much less because there's going to be a discount for volume. And parenthetically too, good luck trying to get your collection insured for the replacement value which DISCOGS says exists. If you are going to get it insured, it's only going to be after an expensive appraisal process. And again, the juice is not worth the squeeze. The reality is that your record collection, which took years to assemble through smart buying, would take years to sell through smart selling. And who's got the patience? So the actual value of your record collection, unless you own a record store and are sort of set up to liquidate it over time, is probably about 25% of the median value, and that's with some effort applied. It's a hobby, not a retirement plan. The next lesson is start cataloging now. If you're just starting to collect records, get in the habit of figuring out which pressing you have. Specifically, learn how to read the dead wax, learn how to distinguish between pressings, learn that what's on DISCOGS isn't necessarily accurate, that you may have a pressing which nobody has recorded yet, or people may have been sloppy or inaccurate or only partial in the information they put on DISCOGS. Start cataloging early before it becomes overwhelming, because by the time that you've got 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 records, if you haven't put any of them into any kind of database, you're going to start to lose track of what you've got. And I know about this quite well, courtesy of a friend who has something just shy of 10,000 records and has an interest in figuring out what he's got, but cannot possibly find the time, frankly, the thousands of hours it would take him to effectively catalog all these records. We talked about him hiring a summer student or paying his children. His children aren't interested in doing it. So start now. Start cataloging now. You won't regret it. And as a side note, clean your records as you go. Don't let that pile up either. The final lesson, and this is one of the most important ones, people are going to disagree about this, but this is dispositionally very important to me. Cut out the deadwood. Be brutal. If it's not something that you're going to listen to, why is it taking up space? Just because everyone else says this is a must-have record doesn't mean you have to buy it, and if you have bought it, it doesn't mean you have to keep it. I mentioned earlier that I built these lists of records that I wanted or that were highly recommended by all kinds of different sources. Some of the time, those lists, from my perspective, were very wrong. So a good example for me is John McLaughlin. I accept the fact that John McLaughlin is a wonderfully talented guitarist. I can't stand his music. Similarly, Weather Report. I can't stand any of that 70s noodly fusion stuff. It's just not my thing. And so why would I keep it just because it's on somebody's top 100 list? Trust your own taste. If you don't like it, let it go. Sell it. Give it away. I estimate that I have sold at a loss, because that's kind of what happens, or given away something like 700 records over the last 6 or 7 years. And of those 700 records, I think I've only had second thoughts or rebought one of them. Partly this is because of my own approach and philosophy. Again, talking about, your identity as a collector to record collecting. I don't really think that anybody can seriously engage with a record collection that is bigger, much bigger than, say, 1,500 records, maybe a little bit bigger than that. But again, 5,000 records, 10,000 records, you have no idea what you have. You'll spend your time buying records that you already own or not being able to find things because the cataloging and the archival process for all that is just too much. So that record you're not playing because you felt you needed to buy it or you liked it at one point, but you're not playing it anymore, don't keep it because it will make somebody else very happy. Don't be a vinyl hog. Well, those are my 12 lessons. I'm sure others of you have other lessons which may be better than these ones or more useful than these ones. So please do share them in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.